Your children may be the reason that you left an abusive relationship, or they may be the reason that you stayed. The truth is, there are survivors who are making very hard decisions every day, and many of them do it with their children's best interest in mind. Understanding the impact that domestic abuse has on your children well into their adulthood can help you to make a more informed decision for their future. Welcome to the Empowered and in Control podcast, the podcast that helps people who have been impacted by domestic abuse to heal and regain power and control after an abusive relationship. I'm your host, Oriana, your favorite domestic violence expert, speaker, and owner of To Rise Advocacy and Consulting. This series that I'm about to do is going to be about protecting children. And today's episode focuses on the impact of domestic abuse and that trauma on children from before birth up to adulthood. Okay. I'm not a mental health professional, and this is not medical advice, but this info is being provided from a domestic violence intervention standpoint, from a prevention standpoint. So please be advised that we will be talking about some very emotionally charged and hard topics. So I urge you to take care of your mental and emotional health by taking a break and revisiting the podcast episode later, or seeking out the professional services of a mental health provider that can help you to process through the emotions that may come up through this topic. Now, let's talk about the Empowered and in Control framework. I'm going to be taking you through that framework throughout the podcast. You can follow along. To follow along, you can click the link in the description to get a copy of the Empowered and in Control wheel. And that e-booklet on my website is how you would follow along with me. You can go to my website, www.toriseac.com. That's toriseac.com. And again, you can click on that link in the description to take you to the shop to get the e-booklet to follow along. Now let's jump into the episode. Did you know that domestic abuse or intimate partner abuse impacts babies physiologically even before they're born? That was wild to me. Let me tell you about this training I went through, and I'm going to kind of read through some of this if you don't mind. But I went through a training through Justice Clearinghouse, and the training was called Intergenerational Trauma and the Role of Family Culture. Fantastic training. If you ever go on the Justice Clearinghouse website, go ahead and take a look at that one. But it was facilitated by Dwayne Bowers, who's a licensed professional counselor and educator. And he referred to the impact of trauma, specifically domestic abuse, by talking about its impact on babies. So he said that research indicates that a mom who experiences domestic abuse during her third trimester experiences a flood of cortisol, which affects the development of the baby's frontal lobes. Those frontal lobes of the brain are what modulate anger and fear. So he used himself as an example, and he said, if he grows up in this environment, this starts to interfere with the development of my hippocampus. The hippocampus is responsible for things like short-term memory, learning, concentration, and those types of activities. He goes on to say, I have difficulty learning. I have difficulty with short-term memory. And now in school, people see that I cannot bond, that I can't manage my anger and my fear, and that I'm having trouble learning. So what kind of diagnosis do they give me? Very often it's ADHD, right? So according to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, children exposed to violence may have difficulty paying attention in school and experience depression and withdrawal. Children's immediate reaction to experiencing domestic violence include generalized anxiety, sleeplessness, aggression, difficulty concentrating, nightmares, bedwetting, and separation anxiety. Lundy Bancroft is a world-renowned expert on abusive men. So he has worked for decades with men who have been in batterers, intervention programs, and things like that. And he wrote a book called Why Does He Do That? In that book, he talks about or references the abuse that children are exposed to. And he says that children who are exposed to the abuse of their mother often have trouble paying attention in school, get along poorly with their peers, and act out aggressively. In fact, they have been found to exhibit virtually every symptom that appears in children who are being abused directly. He also goes on to say that the abuser attributes all of these effects to the mother's poor parenting or to inherent weaknesses in the children. I don't know about you, but that sounds familiar to me. So, intergenerational trauma is one of the many things to be aware of when it comes to protecting children. If you are a pregnant mother and you're in an abusive relationship, there are things that your body is experiencing physiologically that is going to impact your baby. And so if that's something that you weren't aware of before, that's something that now you know that even before the baby is born, those cortisol levels are impacting the development of your baby's brain. And that's something that can be worked on, after birth, obviously. But the key is to remove the stressful environment in order for your body to be able to heal and reset. Same thing for your baby. Another impact on children that a lot of people are not aware of is that there is a correlation a lot of times between domestic abuse or intimate partner abuse and child sexual abuse. There are trainings that you can do to make sure that you are aware of the warning signs of child sexual abuse or assault, and I would highly recommend that you get familiar with that. One of the reasons that I bring this up is because, according to the National Domestic Violence Hotline, one study found that children who are exposed to violence are 15 times more likely to be physically and or sexually assaulted than the national average. So I want to be clear that there are a lot of households that children are witnessing domestic violence. Well, within those same households, there may be child sexual abuse that's happening. And so we can't ignore the behaviors of children when they're in their classrooms, when they're interacting with other kids, when they're interacting with the abuser. There are ways to be able to identify what the behaviors are in children and ways to minimize the risk. Look, I have a webinar that's coming up on May the 29th. I'm going to go into more depth about some of these topics, about intergenerational trauma, about prevention of child sexual assault, which is what actually led me into advocacy. It wasn't domestic violence, actually. It was child sexual assault. I'll also talk about adverse childhood experiences in more detail, which we're going to talk about in just a moment, and also lessons learned. Like, what are children learning in these households? Like, what are some of the lessons that they are carrying with them into their adult relationships and into adulthood? We're going to talk about all of those things today, but very high level. If you want more information about those things, then click the link in the description to sign up for the webinar on May the 29th. But let's talk about adverse childhood experiences. Adverse childhood experiences are traumatic events, including abuse and neglect, that have a tremendous impact on lifelong health, opportunity, and on future victimization and perpetration. It's a questionnaire that has 10 questions on there, and all of them are traumatic experiences that a child would have gone through ages 0 through 17 years old. Now, on the questionnaire, you would put a 0 if you haven't experienced it, or a 1 if you have. And that's one instance. So it doesn't even account for if you've experienced it multiple times, right? But with that questionnaire, the higher your number from 1 to 10, the higher your score, statistically speaking, without intervention, the higher the likelihood that you would experience negative health outcomes later. And that's mental, as far as stress, depression, suicidal ideation. It's also regarding things like high blood pressure, diabetes, stroke, heart failure, as well as risky sexual behavior. A lot of times when survivors are trying to make decisions about whether or not they should leave an abusive relationship, they are thinking about their children. But a lot of times we're thinking about it in terms of what we've been told. Children need their father. No, they don't. Hey, the Empowered and in Control wheel and its guide is a hopeful tool that I developed for people who are impacted by domestic abuse. It's a healing-centered tool that creates a pattern of positive behaviors that people can use to regain power and control after an abusive relationship. Click the link in the description to get your copy for yourself or for someone that you know who is struggling to move forward after the trauma of an abusive relationship. You can be empowered and in control again. Bye. I said what I said. No, they don't. If the father is abusive and not trying to get any help, not trying to change that behavior, then the kids don't need that. One of the traumatic experiences on the ACEs questionnaire is mother treated violently. Mother treated violently. Now, those who want to play devil's advocate, I understand, because also on the ACEs is parents separated. I understand that. But I would venture to say, especially within this field, and as long as I've been doing this work, you're going to have a hard time convincing me that a child staying in that abusive environment and being raised, whether full-time or part-time, by an abusive parent, is going to have a easier time adjusting and having less trauma than if the parents were separated and the non-offending parent or the victim of the couple exposes the children to positive childhood experiences even while they're separated. So ACEs is very important, and it's something that a lot of people who work with children are aware of or should be aware of, but there's not a whole lot of training on it for professionals who are working with domestic violence victims. So when we're talking about juvenile court, when we're talking about divorce and custody, they're not always looking at ACEs. They're not always aware of it, which is why it's very important that you're aware of it, of what the adverse childhood experiences are and what long-term impacts those have on children, so that you can advocate for yourself and for your children. The last thing that I'm going to talk about in terms of impact are the lessons learned. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time. Again, the webinar is about 30 minutes, and we'll go and touch on these things again, but I'll go into a little bit more detail, especially as it pertains to court. But let's talk about some of the lessons that children tend to learn when growing up in an abusive household. Thank you so much for watching the Empowered and in Control podcast. Hey, have you ever thought about starting your own podcast? When people recommended it to me, I had no idea where to start. I didn't know anything about podcasting. And then I saw the ads for the My Seven Figure podcast. Now, seven figures did pique my interest, but I had no idea how people were making money podcasting. What really got me was the idea of being able to help so many more people through a podcast. So I signed up for the course and the community. It is so thorough, let me tell you. From branding to making sure that it's legally protected to monetizing, they left no guesswork and no excuses. So click the link in the description to sign up for my 7-figure podcast course and invest in your future. There are podcasts about everything, but there are certain things that people only want to hear from you. So get started today. People need to hear your voice. Some of the lessons that children learn when growing up in an abusive household can include victim blaming. So when everything in a household revolves around that abusive person, because in that abusive person's mind, everything is about them, right? So all decisions made, all things that are done has to revolve around that person. And so when that happens, children are sometimes learning that in order to, gain favor of the abusive parent, sometimes they are encouraged to jump in with abusing the victim, which means that sometimes abusive parents will have the children join in on making fun of or teaming up on the parent regarding decisions. So that's teaching children from a very young age to blame the victim in the situation as opposed to the abuser, right? In particular, in thinking about young ladies that are growing up in an abusive household where the father is the abuser. Think about the lessons that he is teaching his daughter. The way that he talks about women. Does he talk about women as if they are not intelligent, if they're inferior, if they are liars and can't be trusted, all of those things? Well, that daughter is not only growing up to maybe think those things about herself, but she's also thinking that about other women. So again, when it comes to victim blaming, you see there are a lot of women who don't believe the victim either, and they take his side. But that's something that they've been kind of groomed to do since they were little. It also makes it very difficult for women who are in abusive relationships to put the responsibility on the abusive person as opposed to taking it upon themselves. Because if they've learned all their lives that women are emotional and untrustworthy, then they're going to take that upon themselves when something happens in their relationship, and that's what their abusive partner is telling them. Also, when it comes to sons, our sons learning that this is how they're supposed to treat women, that in order to get your way, you have to use coercion, threats, or violence in order to have a woman to submit. So I'll refer to Lundy Bancroft because, again, I'm not an expert on child psychology or anything like that. Again, this information is coming from a standpoint of domestic violence intervention and some of the trainings and the work that we do in this field and how it kind of intersects. But Lundy Bancroft, in his book, in that same book that I told you about, says that children exposed to partner abuse learn the following lessons from the dynamics they are caught in the middle of. The target of the abuse is at fault, not the abuser. Satisfaction in life comes through controlling and manipulating others. Boys and men should be in control, and females should submit to that control. Women are weak, incompetent, and illogical. Mommies do the hard, constant, responsible daily work of parenting while daddies step in to make the key decisions and share the fun times. These are all things that he said. Don't get mad at me. I didn't say it. I agree with it 100%. But this is something that was in the book that Lundy Bancroft, a world-renowned expert on the mindset of abusive men, talked about when it pertained to children. I personally have heard survivors talk about their 2 or 3-year-old son having a temper tantrum about not being given something that they wanted and telling her, this one victim in particular told me, because I wouldn't give him his toy back, he looked at me in my face and said, "I'm going to have daddy beat you up again." That's what children are learning in abusive households. And without intervention, that little boy may grow up to be an abuser himself. So it's very important that we understand the lessons that are also being learned when we stay in those relationships without intervention. I want to talk about the positive, though, because this has all been very heavy information, and I understand that. But it's something that you need to know, because we have to protect our children. We have to be thinking about what's in their best interest. And while we sometimes make decisions thinking that we have to keep the family together, that children need their fathers, all of these things that we've been taught and conditioned to believe, we got to unlearn some of that, because our children are suffering in the meantime. So let's talk about some of the positive things that we can do. Now, some things are easier to intervene with than others. As a matter of fact, when I talk about the adverse childhood experiences study, I told you there were 10 questions on the questionnaire. Back in 2019, one of the last times that I did a training on ACEs, they said that they were expanding it, that they were going to include 3 new things as it pertained to adverse childhood experiences, because research shows that these 3 things have a major impact on children as well. Those 3 things are racism, bullying, and poverty. I will talk more about this in the webinar. Intervention requires removal from the traumatic experience. Children can be resilient, yes, absolutely, but they have to be removed from the source of the trauma. That's the first thing, okay? Mental health is so important for all of those reasons, the impact that I talked about through ACEs. Having children go to counseling with a really good therapist is key. And there are counselors who work with children as young as 2 and 3 years old and do play therapy, right? Those things are very important. There's also positive childhood experiences. Positive childhood experiences would be kind of the direct opposite, right? It would be situations where children feel able to share their feelings, with their family and feel comfortable doing that, right? Being able to comfortably share how they feel without being judged, without feeling like they'll get in trouble. If they see their family as a source of support, that's a positive childhood experience. If kids are growing up feeling like their family doesn't understand them or doesn't accept them, that's not going to help them in the long run, right? They have to view their family as a source of support and not an adversary. They have to feel like their family kind of looks out for each other in times of adversity, as opposed to every man for himself, right? If children can view their family as a cohesive unit, and by no means am I talking about abusive family members included in that. If Uncle Joey is known to be inappropriate, he don't need to be at the cookout. We've been saying that for I don't know how long now. So that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not saying family has to stick together no matter whether there's, toxic and abusive people within that family. I'm talking about family holding each other accountable for their behavior and excluding people that need to be excluded, so that children have the opportunity to have positive role models in their life, male and female. And then if there are opportunities to enjoy participating in community events, right? In our family, we like to go to a lot of festivals, cultural festivals, learning about different countries and the people in them and the food they eat and all that is really fun. Block party type things. We just recently, my sister and I went to something here in Memphis called Porch Fest, and it was so much fun. Like, you just walk around and there are all these live bands and they're playing on the porch of all these different houses in this neighborhood. And you just look at the list and see what band is playing, what type of music they play, and walk from house to house and listen to music. And everybody was vibing and it was a great time. That's a good community event. There was no drama, there was no violence, nothing like that. The more children can experience those type of things and learn about other people, learn about the differences in cultures and appreciate those, because it's not noticing the differences that's the problem. It's assigning a value of one being better than the other. That's the problem. And finally, feeling a sense of belonging in school. There's so much bullying, and we know this, but for too long, generations, mine and before, have said, well, it builds character. No, it causes stress and anxiety and self-esteem issues and self-worth issues and victimization and re-victimization. Bullying is what we're experiencing in this country right now, with no accountability from the top down. That's not what children need. So we, as adults, as parents, as guardians, as grown people who have children in their lives that you want to protect and really make sure that they have the best shot at having a good future, have to be responsible for putting positive childhood experiences in place. And maybe you didn't know that these things were kind of a recipe for combating the adverse childhood experiences. I didn't know until I went through these trainings. But that's why I wanted to present this information to you. We have to protect our children, but we also have to know the impact that the trauma has on them to be able to identify what things we can remove, right? If we know that certain people are not good to be around our children, we need to remove them. Because if we don't, we're also teaching them, and this is a lesson learned from us, that people can both hurt you and love you at the same time, and you have to stay. Now, I say that knowing full well it's not that easy. Leaving abusive relationships is complicated and it's dangerous. I highly recommend that if you are in an abusive relationship and you have children, that you go through the process of getting in contact with a local advocate at a domestic violence shelter or domestic violence agency or advocacy group to safety plan how to leave. Leaving is a process. It's not an event. It's not something that you just do, because the most dangerous time for a victim is when they leave. I understand that. And I wanted to make sure that you are aware of that and not just hearing this information and deciding, okay, I'm going to take off. There still has to be some safety planning. So again, there's a webinar May 29th. Click the link to sign up for it on Eventbrite, and let's just do everything that we can to make sure that the children in our lives are safe and that they have the best opportunity to take care of their mental health, their emotional health, and that we do the best we can with what we got right now, because it's hard, and I know it is, but we'll make it through it. We are resilient. We've been through a lot. So this has been a very heavy episode, but hopefully with the positive childhood experiences, with knowing that intervention with a mental health provider, with removing those toxic and abusive sources, you are possibly able to create a new plan and do what's best for your children. I'm your host, Oriana, and this has been the Empowered and in Control podcast. Thank you so much for watching. Please share and subscribe. And I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to watch the podcast and do what needs to be done to protect your children. I'll see you guys next week. Bye.